Hello, welcome. I'm Brenda Bailey Hughes, and I welcome you all to Learn Plus. This is a monthly live LinkedIn show where we explore some professional development related topic. And the plus of what we're learning is that there's always a tip or two for those of you that are leaders or in the learning and development space and not only need this topic for yourself, but plan to share it out with others. So welcome to all of you. If you're live right now, you can give us a comment about where you are today so we have a sense of who's with us in the room and where you're from. I and our guest, who I'm going to introduce you here to in just a minute, are both phoning in or videoing in from Bloomington, Indiana. That is about 4 hours south of Chicago. So we're in the Midwestern part of the United States. It is a sunny, blue, and cold December day here in Indiana. So we have Shelby from East Tennessee. I think many of you know Shelby. If you're regulars on the show, Shelby works the magic behind the scenes here for all of the technical things that happen. In our show today, we're going to be exploring conflict. I know many of us at this time of year are stepping away from the office, maybe for a couple of days, weeks, if possible, but spending more time with family. And that brings up some different levels and different kinds of conflict than what we're accustomed to. And of course, there's always ongoing types of experiences of conflict in our workplaces. And so I wanted to do a deep dive into that. And so I was wandering around the halls, the aisles of my local bookstore. Purchase books at your local independently owned bookstores whenever you can, friends. And I saw this book called Positively Conflicted by Sam Ardery. And I know Sam because, again, we live in the same community and have crossed circles in various social and community of faith circles. And so I thought, I wonder if I can get Sam on the show. So I called Sam and he delightfully said yes. And so that is who you're going to get to meet today. Sam is a practicing attorney. He's a mediator. He's mediated thousands of mediations all around the world. He's a renowned speaker. He's, of course, an author. He's got a podcast of the book if you're more into listening than reading. So lots of options. We'll talk more about how you'll get to meet Sam, but I wanted you to have a little bit of history of him as we bring him into the stage. And again, let us know where you're from. Sam, welcome.
Glad to be here. Thanks for asking, Brenda.
Thank you so much for saying yes. We're thrilled to have you today. In fact, stepping out there, we've got Leah from Hollywood. Hollywood is in the room. Leah, great. Glad that you're here. And Mexico is represented. This is great. Leah is suffering some buffering issues. So if anybody else is struggling with that, hopefully it'll get cleared up here in just a second. Sam, thank you for being here. Thank you for actually making time in a day that's filled with mediation to be here. I'm curious as we get rolling here, just so the crowd gets to know you a little bit better, how did you end up working in the mediation space? I mean, did you go to law school thinking I want to mediate? As a chronic conflict avoider, I can't imagine making an intentional choice to put myself in the midst of conflict every day. How did this come about?
Well, I'm going to be as candid as I can be about that answer. Okay. I was a trial lawyer, and then I heard people talking about mediation, and I went to mediation training to find out what they were going to do to me. I had no interest. If you're a trial lawyer, it's all about the competition and trying cases. So I went to learn so I could game the system. The other thing that happened is part of my story is I'm a recovering alcoholic, and I started mediating and stopped drinking within a month of each other in January of 1995. And what I found is the things that I learned about myself in terms of blaming other people, conflict is other people's fault. There are many sides to a story. We are all nuanced, and how to have those conversations without deflecting responsibility. I learned as I got sober and stopped drinking. And what I found is some of those same skills applied absolutely 100% in doing mediations. And so that's that's a short form version of my story.
All right. So it was intentional, but with somewhat hidden agenda at the beginning.
Indeed.
And then expanded into this space. I love that. I love the book. I have studied conflict in the past just because it's an aspect of communication that makes sense to think about. but learned so many interesting things in here. I thought we could explore a couple of those topics. And then, friends, as you're listening, what Sam has agreed to do is just let me throw him some scenarios and kind of respond to what are his thoughts as an expert in conflict and mediation. What are some of his insights around different scenarios? And so I reached out to some learners in advance. We're going to talk about things from both the office and the home, like you've got limited resources in the office and you and others are vying or competing for those. At home, you're getting ready to go to a family event and you know that meddling relative who always tells you how you should live your life will be there. What do you do? We're going to talk about workplace or personal situations where you're not being treated fairly. How do you resolve that? What do you do with that? So we've got lots of specific scenarios that learners like yourselves have shared. But if you have specific scenarios that you want us to think about, put as much or as little detail as you feel comfortable with in the comments. And we will not just use these from other learners, but we will try to address some of your conflict situations as well. Great. We've got Pakistan and it's from Pakistan. Oh, hi there, Aisha. Good. Glad you're here. I also saw New Delhi was here. Somebody from New Delhi. So great global group to learn about conflict. And so glad that you're all here. And managing time zones from all around the world to make sure that you got to hear Sam live. I love that. One of the themes in the book, and so continue to tell us where you're from, and if you want to in the chat, give us a conflict that you'd like some feedback on, and we will try to get to that. One of the concepts, Sam, that really resonated with me from the book was that being right is expensive and overrated. That needs to be a mantra for so many people, I think, right? You want to share a little bit about how you learned that and what that lesson means to you?
Well, what I've learned over time, and certainly my own marriage and even in litigation, is that we all think we have just the right amount of common sense. And what we forget is other people think they have the right amount of common sense as well. And we spend so much of our time in conflict trying to convince somebody else to change their mind rather than being open to the possibility we might be wrong. And when I invest in that righteousness, I can give you just a quick anecdote. Patty and I have been married 41 years, but decades ago, we're having an argument in our living room. And I don't remember what we were talking about, but I remember I was really pressing my point. We were standing up talking, and finally, I know she wouldn't say anything. And finally, she looked at me and she said, "Sam, would you rather be right or would you rather be married?" And I've got goosebumps now telling the story, but it was such a bright, and she left the room before I could answer. And my answer came way too slowly. I mean, because cognitively, I know in my head, my marriage is far more important than being right about whatever this issue was, however many years ago. But in that moment, I was so independently vested. I mean, there's so much talk about self-awareness, but the subtle line of moving from self-awareness to self-absorption comes so quickly and without our notice. And so what I want to pay attention to with conflict is we often feel it before we know it. And the more I'm feeling it, the more it's a time for me to pause. And the more afraid I am, the less likely I am to do it. But if I can keep that in mind, I don't like feeling this way. This is a person I really care about. And you mentioned something about family earlier. And I forget who told me this so many years ago. The reason family can push our buttons so well is that they installed them. Right? I mean, I know yours, you know mine. I mean, it's just, and the thing is, it's such a go-to because in that moment, it makes us feel better. But there's Amor Towles wrote this great book called Rules of Civility. And there's a line in the book by one of the characters, and here's what it says. If in times of high emotion, the next thing you're about to say makes you feel better, it's probably the wrong thing to say.
Oh, makes me feel better because it's going to be I'm going to get you. I got this. This is going to win me a point. This is good. Yeah.
And it's so hard. I mean, it's when I was talking to a group of scholars the other day, and the question I asked them was, what's the most common response to conflict? What's the most common response to conflict? And they had several answers. There wasn't anything wrong with any of them, but here's the one I find most common in conflict, including for me. Why don't you change so I'll feel better?
Oh, yeah.
Right. I mean, that's a long answer, but that's kind of where I go with that on the righteousness.
So that righteousness, that sense of I'm right, I have the common sense, I have the right argument. What's wrong with you? You need to change. So a principle of conflict then for you of engaging positively with conflict is an openness to the fact that maybe I'm not as right as I think, or maybe we're both right, or maybe there's room for me to change as well as you.
Well, and I would say even a little bit more broadly. First of all, you're absolutely right. Speaking of being right, um, but I think there's a concept I call radical listening, and it's not what you learned in Psychology 101 to nod your head and actively listen to make sure the other person knows what you said. Radical listening is listening while being open to the possibility I might be wrong, and listening with no agenda at all. And it is hard and it takes practice, but you will get benefits beyond belief if you at least give it an effort.
What are your tips? How do you lean into listening with no agenda, without planning your next commentary, without listening for the fault in their argument so that you can point the error of their ways out to them? I'm not speaking from personal experience
Of
or
course not.
anything, but
Well, I think one, you start with the physical part of it. Usually in conflict, our physiological response is not so different than if we thought we were in a life or death situation. I mean, like we're in a jungle being chased, or the car's about ready to run over us, whatever it might be. And we don't like to talk about fear because it makes us feel vulnerable. But I find that almost all conflicts, once they get beyond a certain point, it may even just be 30 seconds or so, they have something to do with fear. And the things we tend to be afraid of are losing our sense of safety or security, losing respect or self esteem, losing our perhaps illusion of power or control, or losing our comfort. So if I can, and I realize this all seems academic, but it's really not with practice. If I feel that physically, if the first thing I do is just pause, say, I'm getting pretty straight up here. I really don't like this person. This is somebody I'm living with, but I just really want to scream at him right now. That's a time for me to pause. And pausing is not what you want to do, because you want your defenses to be out there. I mean, the most common responses to fear I have found are anger and sadness. So if you think, and I'm not claiming it's 100%, because nothing is 100%,
yeah.
but I think, though, if you think back of times you've been afraid in conflict, my guess is you've either been sad because you're afraid maybe you misperceived what the relationship is, at least in that moment, or you're angry, and you're going to protect yourself, and you're going to move at them or protect yourself from them in a way that makes you feel like you have control.
Yeah.
And if I can pause even for just a second, I'm so far ahead of 99% of the people in conflict. I mean, a seminal question for me when I'm thinking about conflict, and when I've felt it, is it worth it? And is it safe? Is it worth it? Now, there are times where it's worth it and it's not safe, but because the relationship is so important or the circumstance needs to be dealt with, that even though it's unsafe in terms of we can't control the outcome, it still needs to be done. But I still want to start there, because I can think of so many conflicts, like the one standing with Patty in the living room, that aren't worth it. They are
Yeah.
absolutely not worth it. And yet righteousness tells me, it gets in my head, and righteousness tells me it is worth it. So
Mhm.
I need to leave righteousness to those better able to handle it. Because when has righteousness ever allowed me to convince you you're wrong about something important? I would argue for most of us, almost never.
Almost never. Yeah. One of the images that you've given about, you were talking about the importance of that pause. And I know that you quoted Viktor Frankl in the book on that power of pause, but the imagery that you used that I think might resonate with a lot of us was the remote control to the brain. Like you got to use that pause button. I thought that was such a good a imagery for me to have, in that let's just pause. You've mentioned a couple of times needing to pause, needing to pull those words back in. What if we're on the opposite end of this sort of spectrum of conflict, and that instead of lighting up and coming after somebody, I'm more in that flee or freeze space, and that the reaction to conflict isn't to be quick tempered or um, fast to judgment, fast to, maybe I'm judging, but in my head, but to shut down or to avoid completely. What's your advice for people that identify more with that um, approach to conflict?
Well, first of all, there's nothing wrong with that approach. I mean, that's just, we're all wired certain ways, either because of our DNA or because culturally the way we've learned things. Um, But I think you want to be aware of that. And I think even there, the same thing is true. Think about what you're afraid of that leads you to withdraw, fight, and flee or freeze. And even if you talk about it with someone you really trust, with whom you're not in conflict, and say, I have these conflicts at work, I have these conflicts at home with my spouse, my kids, my partner, whatever it is, because most of us have a pattern within which we behave, right? I mean, somebody pushes the button and we withdraw. Somebody pushes the button and we come at you, whatever that might be. And I think, okay, what is it that leads me to be so afraid that I feel like I can't respond at all? What is it that I'm so afraid that I freeze and I can't even listen at all? And I think you don't have to force yourself to talk, but one of the things that I find incredibly powerful, and this happened again, we get most of our practice at home. I came home one day and Patty said, I feel like I'm living with 3 people in this house, and there are only 2 of us that live in that house. She said, you, me, and your ego.
Oh,
I did not see that as a warm embrace moment.
no.
But
I don't
what,
think that was a warm and fuzzy comment there.
no, it wasn't, and she didn't intend it that way. But I mean, even saying, I can feel like my defensiveness come up. I mean, and it doesn't mean that she was wrong about those things, or what she was trying to make a point about whatever was going on in our life at that point. And this was a time, I tell lots of failure stories. This was a quasi success story. What I knew by my defensiveness is I had no ability to respond. And what I told her was exactly that. I said, I'm so defensive right now. I'm not saying you're wrong about that. I have no capacity to respond in any meaningful way. I promise I'll have this conversation. I'm not good enough to have it now. And I stopped. Now, as Patty will tell you, that doesn't happen very often, because I'll light up and want to explain to her. It doesn't work well. But I think it's back to the physicality and think, okay, do I care about this relationship? I mean, one of the concepts I didn't talk about in the book, but I talk about to people a lot about, is a concept I call PARC, PARC. And that's when you feel the kind of the bile rising in your throat. First you pause, then you assess, then you reflect, and then you choose. And in that moment, because we are afraid of somebody, if we are perhaps more introverted and less quick to respond, when that person's coming at us, it can feel like we're in such a threat. We got to do something. And so pause is not natural, but I can pause. And then I can say, okay, what's going on here? I mean, is there a perspective other than mine? My guess is there is, because this person is not really threatening me physically in any way, maybe even not even emotionally. What's that? And then I can say, okay, as I reflect on it, what are the personalities? What's the context? What might be going on with them? Because in that moment, I'm thinking about where they might be, not why they're wrong. And it's huge to think about, because that person is doing what makes sense to them. It may not make sense to anybody else in the universe, but it makes sense. And so if I've paused, assessed, reflected, then I can choose. And my choices aren't always right. They're not even always good. But that can happen in a period of about 30 seconds. And if all you do is pause, you're ahead, which is what Frankl talks about. But that notion of PARC, and I use that particularly if I know I'm going to be having a contentious conversation. I mean, there are people in my family, like everybody's family, that we might struggle with. And I think, okay, I can do PARC before I go into the situation. I can say, well, okay, this is a person that for whatever reason scares me enough that I don't respond well. Let me think about what's going on with them. Let me think about what this dynamic is with us. Let me think about making a different choice. And the other part of it is, I mean, if you were starting to play the piano, you would not to expect to be playing Mozart's concertos right away. But with these things that are intellectual, like conflict, that we're trying to do differently, we think, well, now I know it. I ought to be an Olympic athlete. And so you can start with the smaller things, and you can also show yourself a little bit of grace when it doesn't go the way you wanted it to.
Yeah. I appreciate that. Because I'm sure I'm getting it wrong a lot. I love the idea in PARC of choose there being the last step in the process. And that in the book, you really make this case that sometimes choosing will mean not confronting. And you talk through some great examples on that. And I think that you talk about engaging in conflict. By the way, you use that word, not managing conflict, which is what we hear. And I'm curious about, you were very intentional about engaging. So I'm curious about that. But I'm also thinking about this idea that you consider it engaging in conflict if I go through those 4 steps, even if at the end, maybe I've got some issue with Sam and I pause and I assess and I reflect and then I choose not to confront you, that would still be engaging in conflict. I think sometimes I beat myself up a little bit because I've chosen not to engage. And then I'm like, oh, there you are being a doormat. You're being passive. You're avoiding conflict again. And maybe I am sometimes because of fear. And I think that's one of the interesting pieces to me is how do we suss out when we are avoiding conflict because of fear, and when are we choosing intentionally, deliberately not to confront someone because that was the best choice in this particular circumstance. So a lot of things to respond to: engage versus manage. And how do you know the difference between just kind of wimping out and hiding from conflict and being self-aware enough to say, no, this is not a good opportunity for me to confront.
Well, I think for most of us, you can look at your patterns. I mean, once we don't have to be my age to see some patterns develop. We can see them develop at 15 years old, 20 years old, 25 years old. We can be at a lot and say, oh, I run every time, or my inclination is to run every time. And what sometimes we forget is it is a courageous step simply to stay there and listen. That's a choice to engage, not to shut down. Now, there are times when, like I said, running makes sense. The reason I talk about engaging, not managing, is I think part of conflict is being honest with ourselves about powerlessness. I mean, we could have a conflict. I am powerless to change you if you don't wish to change. And even when I talk to law students and lawyers and insurance executives and people like that, they talk about all this convincing and advocacy. Well, that's all about me. That's 100% about me, because I'm back to I want you to change so I'll feel better.
Yeah.
So I think more appropriately, what we want to think about is, can I lay the groundwork that increases the chances that not only might I listen to them, but they might listen to me? And rarely does that happen with me going point blank, punching you in the nose and telling you you're wrong, right? I mean, it might, because that makes me feel safe. And the reason I say I don't talk about the manage piece is I think it's not only often illusory with other people, it's illusory with ourselves. I mean, think about what I'm talking about now. If you are a natural non-engager in conflict, I mean, your reaction is going to be to shut down and get out of the way. You have chosen to, that's your reaction. If you choose to pause even for a second and then run away, you've then engaged. You've made a decision to respond, not submitted completely to reacting.
Yeah.
And that's a big deal. If that's and here's the other part about all conflicts. I think they're like this conversation we're having. Anytime I have a conversation like this, or I give a talk to somebody, or I do a mediation, there are always three. There's the one I prepare for, there's the one I have, and there's the brilliant one I do on the way home.
Yes.
And I haven't found, I just found over time, there's nothing unique about me. I'm just not that special. And so if I respond that way, I've found in talking to other people, they do the same thing. They prepare for this conflict conversation. They then have this conflict conversation. It might even have gone partly the way they wanted, in which case then they want even more. Say, but if I just done this, who knows? You're not going to have that chance to find out. And so when I often a question, if we were all in a big room together, a question I would have on the board is, even if blank is not okay, blank can be. Even if blank is not okay, blank can be. And I'll ask people to answer that question, and I'll tell them what my answer is. So you want to take a shot? I'm not trying to embarrass you. There's not a right or wrong answer.
Even no. So are you saying, like, in a specific conflict, I'm filling this out? Even if blank is not okay, blank might be. Even if lying is not okay, maybe withholding some information could be.
Absolutely. And that's one of 1,000 answers.
Although I'm feeling, even as I say it, a little like, I'm not sure I believe that.
Well, you were courageous to answer it at all. You could have deflected. So you showed courage in the face of fear. And that's fear of respect, self-esteem, all those things, that are still there, even if they're subtle and they don't matter. Yeah. But here's the way the way it was once said to me: even if circumstances are not okay, I can be. Even if results are not okay, I can be. It's not a promise that you're going to like everything that happened, but even when I talked to again, I was talking to a group of freshman students at IU, and I put that question up there, and we talked about it. And I said, I will bet that all of you. In fact, I asked them, I said, how many have had a circumstance between now and the time you were born or can remember where you didn't get what you wanted? And everyone raised their hand. And I said, and yet you're sitting here now. You've done a
You're
great
okay.
job. You're a scholarship student. So you are okay. I'm not promising you will be okay, or you didn't make the team. You didn't get in the play. You didn't get the grade you wanted. You didn't get in the school you wanted. You didn't get the job, whatever it is. But most of us with enough tread on our tires, which I would argue is by 8 or 9 years old, have had some disappointment. I mean, I've got grandkids that are 7 years old. I mean, something will happen. They don't get the dessert they want. It's their worst day ever. And they are deeply invested that it's their worst day ever. And what I forget is I think like a 7-year-old sometimes. So
That didn't go my
that's
way.
right.
It's the
That's
worst
right.
day ever.
And we've all had it, right? I mean, so if I can live under that umbrella of even if circumstances are not okay, I can be. It takes a little pressure off because even if it still doesn't feel, I may still believe it's right. I didn't get the job. I didn't get the raise. It will never be okay. I can think, well, there's 1/2 of 1% of me that remembers when I thought that same thing about getting into school.
Yeah.
Because all of those things that we get, every time you get there, it moves.
Right.
There's no arrival place. Not I got the job, I got the partner I wanted, I got the kids. You pick whatever, the car, whatever it is. It never stays. The satisfaction never remains. And if I can keep that in mind, I can know the fact that I didn't get. Now my 7-year-old grandson does not understand that, but with time, hopefully he might be willing to have that conversation or just experience it with him. He doesn't need to learn it from me.
Yeah, no, I love that idea because, like you were saying, the fear is what drives some of the response, the reaction, I guess, to conflict, and putting that, even if circumstances aren't okay, I'm okay in my forefront of my mind, maybe can calm that fear long enough that I can make that pause and that deliberate choice. We have some questions that I want to get to. From Dimitri talks about a couple of things. One, the second step. Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, this one first, and then we'll go to Dimitri's other one. The assess of the PARC piece seems troublesome in a conflict situation. What can you describe what you mean by assessment, maybe, Sam?
Yeah. If I feel it physically and I think, okay, it's time for me to pause, even if it's just for 5 or 10 seconds, I know something's going on where they see it differently than I do. So that assess piece is there a world in which someone still with perfectly fine intentions sees this differently than the way I do? Their perspective. I mean, it's not so different. And this is a real physical example when you're driving down the road and you think there's an animal's been hit on the road and you find out it's a cardboard box.
Yeah.
Our brains are always telling us something. And the quickest thing that we tell each other is, again, why don't you change or blame you? I want to make it your fault because it is hard work being the one that engages. And there are times when I talk some about the justice gene, when I shouldn't have to be the one that does it. Well, I would posit it the other way, say, if I want things to be better, and if I have a skill set that may be a little better than theirs, it doesn't mean I'm a better person than them, but I have an obligation to use it.
Yeah.
I don't want to default to, well, they're not trying, I'm keeping it with it. They've made me, even though they haven't made me do anything, do this every time. It may be that I just have a better skill set. And if I do have a better skill set, I need to use it. The other thing that's a real short thing, and it doesn't have to have a religious component at all. When I think that, why don't you change so I'll feel better? And I feel that physicality, what I'll say, and this kind of goes to the second step assessment. I say, bless you, change me. It's just real quick. Bless you, change me. It's not what I feel. It's not what I think, but at some level, it lowers the pressure some. And even if I can't get to that troublesome conclusion, right or wrong, about what that assessment is, it reminds me it's not all about me. There's someone in this conflict. Is it worth it? It takes me to different places. But that quick phrase is really helpful to me.
I love that. And Dimitri, so I think where you and I were both hearing assessment, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but was a judgment. That assessment meant deciding whether the other person is wrong or right, in which case, yeah, we're in a dangerous spot. And instead, assessment is that questioning of our own righteousness. Is there a possibility that someone else has a different perspective on this? And then Dimitri had a second question that I wanted to get to. How do you secure the results of conflict conversation that just keep happening over and over and over? We've talked about it. We thought we had a resolution. It's a week later. We're talking about the same thing again.
Well, I think there again, you ask, is it worth it and is it safe? But if you think it's worth it, because most people don't change, then it's a chance to prepare for a really direct conversation. And whether that conversation, knowing that the other person's not going to like it. And you could say, and this is more like from Psychology 101, what is it about me that's participating and feeding this same recurring conflict? Because there's no conflict without me. If I just say, okay, that's who they are. I mean, Patty and I are having dinner with some folks. And they said they'd been married less than us, but so long time. They said, what is the secret to a long marriage? And Patty, without missing a beat, said, acceptance and a really short memory. And even though you're going to remember the recurring conflict, you need to think about whether it's worth it or simply accept that's where that person is and not engage them on it. Now, there may be things at work that you have to engage, and you may need to involve supervisors, but you need to think about what the consequences are. Because I say, well, this recurring conflict is really bad. And then I say, the question I want to ask is, compared to what? Compared to not having a job? Compared to going the boss and bringing them in and making everybody mad? Compared to me just doing a little bit more work? I mean, and it may be that the answers are otherwise, that you simply decide you can't live with that. And then you've got some different decisions to make. If that person won't change, am I going to look for another job? Am I willing to transfer? Because it's like that old definition of insanity, doing the same thing and expecting different results. That happens in workplaces. It happens in homes. It happens in our own heads. Yeah. This time I won't eat the chocolate cake, right? Well, until it's in front of me. So those are the kinds of things that I think, because often conflicts aren't resolved. They're just temporarily suspended. And it's kind of back with the family piece. It is easy for me to want my family to change. It is hard for them to change, and they want me to change just as much as I want them to. So engaging, it's not just engaging conflict, it's embracing discomfort. To engage conflict is uncomfortable. So there's not a pain-free option. Pain-free is option F, which is fantasy. So there may be too much pain and you don't want to do it or unwilling to do it. That's okay. But you want to make the decision.
Yeah, you want that decision to be intentional and thoughtful, not just that reactionary piece. Yeah. Zildo talks about thinking about conflict in two ways. First is an opportunity to learn with a challenging perspective from the other, and then how can I improve something from that conflict? The second way she thinks about it is he thinks about it as the conflict situation. And in my opinion, there is a simple way. We just need to find out a common matter between both different thoughts to pursue the same goal. Yeah. Thank you, Zildo. I appreciate that comment. As a follow-up, and please, Sam, feel free to respond in any way to Zildo, but I was thinking, he talks about having the pursuit for the same goal. What happens when, and this was one of the scenarios someone sent in, when we do have the same goal, but we have really different approaches to getting to it. So that you'll appreciate this because this was a young attorney that sent it in, and he wrote, I've got these cases, and we all agree from the beginning. Well, we don't even agree on which case to take or not take. And then do we take it to trial or not? And do we file this motion or not? And do we call this witness or not? The end goal was the same for him and his senior partners, but how to get there just seems like just so much strife.
I'll give you a specific legal story. There was a lawyer I talked to, a relatively young lawyer, experienced, but not as old as me. And I hadn't seen him in a while in mediations. And I said, I haven't seen you lately. Is it something that I'm doing? Cases have changed. What's going on? He said, what happened about 2 years ago is every time a case came in, and he's defending cases, so his clients are being sued, before I did anything, before I sent a letter, before I sent a text, before I sent an email, before I responded to what they sent me, I picked up the phone and I called the other lawyer. And when I called the other lawyer, I said, how you doing? This case has been assigned to me. I just thought I'd touch base with you and see whether you had some ideas of anything we can do to move this along more quickly, or any specific things that you think are important for me to look at on behalf of your client. And he said, I'm doing about 10% of the mediations I used to, because he created the dialogue at the beginning. He didn't call to make a case. He wasn't trying to convince them. And the common ground was simply, they're both doing work. Statistically, we know 98% of all cases settle. However, they often settle still sometimes on the courthouse steps when mediation doesn't work. So it was a chance for him to reach out to the other person with no agenda other than to open a line of communication in a way that we don't do that often these days, right? We text, we send an email. We think that, like my own adult children will say, yeah, I talked to so-and-so. What they meant is they texted them or they emailed them. And I'm not criticizing that. Everybody culturally, we all grow up differently, but there is something about that voice-to-voice contact that is genuine and that is open and seems like it really is listening, that lowers some barriers, both cognitively and below that conscious level.
Love that. You mentioned earlier the justice gene. I want to return to that with one of the specific scenarios that a learner sent, and that was, I am being treated unfairly at work. And then he documented some of the specifics. He's got seniority, and yet someone else got the better schedule, the better office, the better projects. So that it's not purely perceptual, I guess, is what I'm saying, that he's being treated unfairly. It looks like there's some evidence of that. And yet that's the scenario, that's what it is. So what do we do when we start feeling there's an unfairness here about how I'm being treated?
Well, first of all, what I like to think about that is I am exclusively bound by my own lenses through which I see the world. I don't think people on the whole get up in the morning wanting to treat other people unfairly. I think some do, but I think it tends to be the exception.
Just a few. That's right. Not very many.
And I remember, as I tell the story, I got fired when Patty was pregnant with our first child, 2 weeks before Christmas, and we just bought a house. Now, the way I present that story, how can an employer be that kind or that unfair, right? I mean, I presented the story to you. Well, there are some things I did at work or didn't get done at work, and these people weren't bad people. But to tell you just how bad a job I was doing, they were willing to fire a guy 2 weeks before Christmas with a pregnant wife who just bought a new house. Now, I'm not claiming that that's that learner's situation. Right. But if there's anybody, two parts to this. If there's anybody we trust who will give us honest feedback or ask us honest questions to evaluate, talk to them, maybe even within the organization, if that doesn't make you too vulnerable. The other thing I would think about, and these are 3 questions I tell people to ask themselves about these difficult conversations.
Let's write these down. I love these.
First is, what do you want?
Okay.
What are your biggest fears and concerns? And what trade-offs are you willing to make? Because there are always trade-offs between wants and fears. So I would guess, and I don't want to speak for this person, but often when we feel like we want to be treated fairly. Yeah. We're afraid this is going to last forever. We'll never be treated fairly. I'll be trapped in this situation forever. 1,000 other things may happen. Or if I bring this up to my boss, I might really learn that the boss thinks this is fair treatment. They got a problem with some of my work, no matter what my annual evaluation says. Right. And is it possible that I will be treated even worse? Is it possible I will need to seek another job if I hear that? There's sometimes I don't want to hear things. And is that trade-off of another job? So I think that goes to, is it worth accepting? And if it's not, then I need to accept that it is maybe unsafe at some level to have the conversation. And if I have it, I want to have it really skillfully. I want to say, if I go in telling the boss, you've treated me unfairly, blah, 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 the boss is defensive right away. Right away. Yeah. I think I'd say, boss, do you have a time? You want to find a time that's good for the boss? Say, is there a time you have 10 or 15 minutes to talk? Hopefully the boss says yes. If not, they're sending you another message anyway. Say, I'm struggling with this. I don't know if my perspective's off, but I'd like to hear from you because I really want my job, as I see it, is to make your job easy and do really well in this position I have. There are more things I'd like to do here. It looks like some of these people with less seniority are getting some things that I would like to have. Is it because you don't know I want them? Do you think they're doing better? Is there improvement I can make where I can get some of these better assignments in the future? Now, in that moment where I'm just mad about being treated unfairly, and this is I'm not saying this person is being treated fairly. Right. It's not making no judgment on that. But if I want to engage it, there are better ways to engage it than go in and say, I'm treated unfairly. Yeah. But because I get so scared when I'm treated unfairly, but think about what those fears are, that I can go, and this is what I got to do to stand up for myself. And by golly, I'm not going to respect myself if I don't. There is a way to think about that more broadly and even try it out with, again, somebody you trust, doesn't have to be in the organization. This is what seems to be happening. You're 99% sure you're right. But back to being open to that 1%, the boss apparently has a perspective that's different from mine. And as scary as it is, I want to know it, or I'm willing to accept this and let the conflict be.
Yeah. Interesting. That option F for fantasy is another resonant part of the book for me, that I think too often I live in that space of, well, it's not, I've done the analysis to know it's not worth, the trade-offs here are, just not worth it to me, but maybe they'll just magically change and everything will just go away, and kind of forcing myself to see fantasy for what it is. So far, we've talked mainly about, how are we doing on time? Yeah, I'm going to switch gears from our specific scenarios that involve us to because I have a lot of leaders and HR folks that watch the show. If I'm not personally involved, but I've got employees that are squabbling to the extent that it's starting to affect performance in the department, what's my role? What are some tips from an expert mediator to a completely non-expert mediator on how I deal with some other people's conflict?
Well, I think the first thing you said was role. What is your role? I mean, there are organizations where they just decide part of our organization is we're going to let people fight it out. It's going to be survival of the fittest. We're going to see what happens. Somebody will leave, somebody won't. That's not most organizations, but it is some. And if you watch, and sometimes the manager just runs from it because they're afraid. Um, I would, and I know I sound like a one-trick pony, but I'd come back to those same questions. What does that leader want? What is that leader afraid of? And what trade-offs are they willing to make? Because what you want, I presume, is not the squabbling and productive workplace.
Right.
What you're afraid of is, what if I engage in the quote wrong way? What
I
if
make
this
it
person
worse.
responds badly? And that is a possibility. Do I do it individually? Do I do it collectively? And it takes some skill to do. And even if you say I'm going to talk to them directly, there is a tendency from a manager standpoint to behave like the school principal. He said, here's how you're supposed to behave. Here's how you do. I saw you do this. I saw you do that. That's not likely to solve it. It might push it underground, but it doesn't likely solve it. Decide how brave you're willing to be with it. Even if circumstances are not okay, I can be. Even if this conflict is not okay, our organization can be. Even if one of these people leaves, that's okay. I mean, but I think we jump to the end game and we think it can only be okay if they're wanting to have picnics together. It may be that there's accommodations that both of them need to make, or you need to hear what they think the common sense part of it is. And the minute they start talking about what's wrong with the other person, say, okay, let's say you're right. Let's say you're right is a really powerful tool. It's not saying you're right, but let's say you're right. How do you want to respond to that? That has nothing to do with them changing their behavior.
Oh, well, you say that again. Let's say you're right.
What would you like to change about you in this situation that has nothing to do with their behavior?
Yeah.
What can you change? I mean, bless you, change me. Because again, and this has really kind of come with time. I mean, I believe it, even though some will argue I'm wrong. I think everybody gets up in the morning wanting to give life their best shot. I really do. I think everybody tries to do their best, and sometimes their best is just no darn good, including mine. And I want you to excuse me, but I want to judge you and earn it, and I want you to earn it back. It's like trust. If I can keep that in mind and think, okay, they're responding in a way that seems to me disproportionate. Whatever it is, it's disproportionate. To them, it's proportionate as can be. What effort am I willing to spend to see why that response seems productive to them? Do they want something different from me? Are they afraid of different things? Are they making different trade-offs? Am I doing something to trigger that? Because that's really what I've got a shot at doing anything about.
Yeah. Great stuff. Oh, so good. I know some of you had questions that you didn't get answered. So Sam, if we have more questions for you, if we need more Sam, I've pointed out the book. I think if all of you stay on for just a second after we log off, there's a QR scannable code that will take you directly to the link to the book. But how do we get more wisdom from Sam?
Well, first of all, you might be in a small club that wants it. But if you do want it, you can go to my website, samardery.com or samardery.net. It's up. Either one will get you there. And there's a place for you to reach me if that's what you want to do. My book is available in a free podcast, wherever you get your podcast, Positively Conflicted. Chapters 5 and 6 are being posted today. So in the next 4 weeks, every chapter will be up there, including an epilogue with Patty that I talk about. Who I talk about so much.
Oh, I can't wait for that.
So she doesn't want to do it, but she's agreed. That's the best way to get a hold of me. Send me an email. Let me know the context, because I get lots of emails. I do my best to respond to all of them. If you don't hear from me, you can try my office, Bunger and Robertson, because it may have gotten thrown to spam or junk mail or something else. So my website's the best way to give it a shot.
Head to the website, head to the book. Lots more wisdom in the book that we didn't get to talk about today. Learners, thank you all for your amazing questions. We will see you back in January. For those of you taking some time off for any kind of upcoming holiday, I hope you are safe and that you enjoy that. Sam, thank you so very much for your time and your insight today, everyone.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Brenda. I really enjoyed it.
Take care.